think security and protection of intellectual property rights, I think, are where some of the risks currently lie. It's going to become far more prevalent. It's going to be embedded in many things. It's that sort of dripping of data that is unconscious that people need to be more concerned about. And I think the risk is, I'll say, through naivety or just lack of understanding. If you've got AI and it's purely giving you, here's my recommendation without the reasoning, then would you trust it? That hybrid of the person and the artificial intelligence seems to be getting far superior results. But as a human, you're making the ultimate decision on what action to take, because you can compute things like the consequences of failure and all of these other things. And so there's plenty of cases like that, I think, out there.
Graham Gourlay, lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
So we're going to have a little chat, more business related this time. So you have a lot of experience in technology, in the corporate enterprise world. I'm sure some people know exactly what that is, but for those that don't, give us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so my background is originally in electrical and electronic engineering, but at a time when computers were starting to become accessible. And once I had exposure to it, I thought that's where I'm going to go. So I'm leaving university, then worked for a big American IT company, and then progressed through a few over a number of years. But always at the front end of it. It's always been the sort of client-facing implementation, typically with bigger organisations. And that's the bit I like the science of it. It's not instead of that, but I've always been fascinated and sort of more driven by how do you make things work in the real world.
Well, so now we've got what I think a lot of people consider the AI revolution. And we've talked in previous podcasts about the AI revolution having a similarity to the internet revolution and the industrial revolution. So at the heart of that, if we were to describe kind of what that means, that would be a huge change through technology, where that brings a lot of fear, brings a lot of opportunity. How do you see this AI revolution?
Yeah, perhaps it's evolution rather than revolution is the first thing. As when you look at how has artificial intelligence been used in the corporate world over many decades, then it's been there a long time. One of the things I did, a summer vacation job, was working on a nuclear power simulator, and that was full of artificial intelligence. Now that was early on in my career, but some very clever mathematicians and an implementation, all in software, of simulating a nuclear power station, like 41 years ago.
Okay, so what year would that be?
That's 1984.
1980, well, somewhat poignant, isn't it? Little George Orwellian. So I think we had a discussion before filming and covered a few points which we wanted to discuss in this podcast. And I think that does give context. The last podcast was Professor Sharples, yes, who had an incredible background and history in artificial intelligence. For him, specifically generative AI, dating back to the late 70s. And obviously the company that you're with, Azaris, yes, we know well, and we have Gaia AI, and we're more business focused. Given your experience, what do you think is a risk which is being somewhat overlooked these days? Yeah,
so I think security and protection of intellectual property rights, I think, are where some of the risks currently lie. You look at the organisations out there; they have often invested a considerable amount of time and money into generating data, and it can often be their competitive advantage. So being able to secure that and making sure it doesn't just leak out I think it's significant for these organisations. Not just in terms of reputation. We often hear in the media, in the press, about leakage of data and the implications that come from it. So that's one aspect to it, but it's also the competitive advantage side of things as well, where companies can really use that to get ahead of their competitors. And I think that's where artificial intelligence starts to cut in, because AI is layered on top of data. Yeah. So therefore, the AI piece that's becoming, I think, more recognised in the outside world. I think inside of some of these companies, it's already there and being used in many of them. Then it means people are more aware of it and more likely to want to use it. But I think in the general public, they're probably not sufficiently aware of some of the implications around how their data is used and what some of the consequences of that getting outside of its allowable parameters.
If we were to give examples, and what would be really good for you to have a run through would be how things used to be with a tech implementation. But to give some context, if we were to have a Word document, and let's say you're a lawyer and you're writing a really important contract, in the old world, that would be subject to a lot of security within your own network, within your own company. You wouldn't want that getting out within other contexts, your sales figures. So that would be proprietary information, as you said, working on technology where you're documenting methodologies within the nuclear industry. I mean, you could say very simple up to very complex, but just everyday tasks and everyday programs. The rules were, and weirdly are still, through very good reason, that you protect proprietary information and your day-to-day business operations. You don't expose information. Now, what's interesting when we look at something like Copilot, powered by a large language model, the nature of a large language model, and again, it's something we've touched upon with Professor Song and various others, is suddenly these private domains are leaking information out and training models, but based on information that old school rules wouldn't allow. And the funny thing is, still don't allow, but the lines have been blurred and possibly crossed. So could you walk us through, pre-AI, what a tech implementation would look like? And what is a tech implementation?
Yeah. So I guess it has maybe two dominant ends to it. One is the back end, which people think of as data centers, where all the servers, all the infrastructure software is sitting, connected on network to endpoints, which could be computers, phones, tablets. So that's a typical implementation, is implementing those two pieces and making them all work together. The wrapper around that is often security, and I have seen companies become stronger on that over the years, with single sign-on, two-factor authentication, all of these type of activities, which I think more people are now familiar with, all designed to protect the individuals and the company's assets. But I think the risk is, I'll say, through naivety or just lack of understanding of how some of these things work, that you could be on a particular network. We hear of people joining public networks and having data stolen, or at a more physical level, especially in London, phone theft. You can be a set of traffic lights with your phone and somebody goes past in a moped and takes it. Immediately, you think you've got your secure phone and suddenly you don't. Yeah. So those are the kind of risks that exist. But on the IT implementation, the sort of technology end of the business is designed to provide the scalable systems that function and with security all around them to mitigate that risk. And one of the risks with AI is, as you just said, is that the data you think is securely held within either a physical data center or a virtual one that could be hosted by some other companies. The risk of that data leaking out to ultimately data collectors can happen. At which point, we look at some of the large language models that are out there right now. There's a reasonable amount of that has been built upon data that is ultimately copyrighted. So I was watching something like just this morning, that exact subject, where realizing that they've got copyrighted data being fed into large language models that's then going back out again. So companies are at risk of losing some of their intellectual property, not through, I'll say, deliberate negligence. It's just that sort of drip kind of effect where it leaks out over a period of time.
If you're my competitor and I'm using what I think are the systems that I've always used, such as the Microsoft product set, but in doing so, my entire organization is seeping information, and you think, how would you get that information? So previously, historically, you may have done corporate espionage. There could have been methodologies. Maybe you've recruited some of my team. You've poached people. Well, now you could use the same system, inquire about things, and effectively there is the possibility that you don't need to do any of that anymore. You can take the data, because effectively my organization would be giving it away, not necessarily involuntarily, that is by consequence what's happening, but somewhat unknowingly. So the risk is actually very real. Yes. That brings into the context of why we have security protocols in place in the first place, why there is a GDPR data protection, there are HIPAA rules. There's rules across the world which organizations are held far, far more to account than the likes of the retail market. Something Professor Sharp also talked about was social media. That in itself is grand theft auto of data on a global scale in many ways. So the product is the person, the user, and they're sharing their images, they're sharing their locations, they're sharing their tastes, what they like, so that they can be sold to. So try and give us an example of a project you've worked on in your younger career, from an end-to-end basis, which would help paint the picture.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of one out of the sort of digital implementation of media, satellite television. And in those days, the data centers were owned by the companies. So, straight away, they weren't, if you like, outsourcing it to some of the other companies you might do now. So straight away, they had physical containment in buildings that they owned and were secured, and they knew exactly what was in there. And the connection to external networks was either not needed and not in place, or very constrained and limited. So the data was contained within these very controlled peripheral boundaries. And so the chances of data getting out of that unconsciously was low, because it was contained within that company, even down to far enough terminals being on RS-232 connections connected straight into these computers. So you couldn't really, the data would not leak out. But as we've gone through the internet age, with many things being more interconnected, then the risk of the data being let loose just increases. Data espionage is the sort of thing that people get very attracted to in terms of attention, but I think these are very deliberate outlier cases. It's that sort of dripping of data that is unconscious that people need to be more concerned about.
Well, I'm just thinking, we have some of our team here to perform research functions as well. So I remember, Dean, see if you can find out how much data is created every year and what the curve is since really the propagation of the internet, because this is a fascinating factor.
Yes.
And again, one of the reasons for these podcasts is to give people an insight into the world we live from what happens behind the scenes. So if we look at the curve of data, every year, from memory, it was something like 18 months, the amount of data that exists in the world is doubled.
Yeah,
So it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Now that data needs to be stored somewhere. It's being created from somewhere. It creates a massive amount of problems. So it's actually, that's the food which is feeding AI. But it's what has created this massive influx or massive growth of data centers. And with every corporate creating data, every consumer creating data, the problem of understanding data, and also there's a lot of bad data in there. So the word we were talking about, efficacy, the efficacy of systems. So I think the analogy we used was playing darts, and the aim is to get 180. So 180. Now, if you're off target and the efficacy is low, then you may aim for 180 and get 57. So it's going to take a lot longer to get the results. And also, would you trust and rely on something which you know is maybe 60% accurate, but you don't know which percentage is not accurate? That's actually where AI can help solve problems. Dean, what have you found? There we are. 147 zettabytes of data are created every year. In 20
days, 402 million terabytes.
That's mad. So that type of scale, where's the data coming from? Even the idea of tracking it is insane.
It is. I mean, yeah, and part of what's enabling that, I mean, if you look at the profile of computing capacity, storage, and cost, that's enabling it. You go back in time, I still remember the days when people were archiving data onto tape, and the tapes got destroyed, and it was because of the cost of storing the data. So you don't have to go too far back in history to find that the data that was generated doesn't even exist anymore. But you bring that forward to today, then storage capacities are available readily through a lot of service providers. The cost of it keeps going down, so the business case for storing it is there. And so whilst it can be done and done efficiently, done at low cost, the data will just keep getting kept. And the generation of it, as you just said, just keeps increasing.
So this is another part where when people say the word infrastructure and data centers, there's a thing called cold storage. So the cost of storing data in hot storage might be, let's say, $1.
Yeah.
But if you don't need it so much, then you can move it to cold storage, which might be 1 cent to store compared to $1. It just takes a bit longer to access. Yeah. So there's this huge infrastructure constantly growing and this massive demand for data centers, which then leads to the whole situation with NVIDIA. Yes. So GPUs. Give me a simple overview of what a GPU is.
Ultimately, it's a processor of data, is what it is. So we take NVIDIA, they've basically come along and evolved technology that can process data at a very fast rate. So that's more to do with how quick can you generate answers. So if you think about data, you've got originating data, it gets processed and it creates new data, which are often results, the bit that the humans want to see or understand. And elapsed time can be significant. I think at a personal level, how long would you wait between hitting the return key to getting the answer?
Good way of looking at it.
Yeah, and so the human impatience part starts to cut in. So where the GPUs cut in is the programs can utilize the increased processing speed that companies like NVIDIA are providing, which means the elapsed time to get the answer from the data gets dramatically reduced. Or if the time stays the same, the amount of data you can process goes up. So you can get answers far faster or to a greater level of accuracy because it can process more data.
And I suppose the scale element is interesting. As one individual, if one human is even one human, it's similar to an F1 car in that instance. So we're seeing all the time, we're hearing, our skin is sensing temperature. There's a huge amount of sensors that a human has processing all of this information in our brain, and we're reacting upon it. For example, even picking up a bottle. And I often will say to the development team that we work with, close your eyes and try picking up a bottle. And suddenly people look a bit silly. So you're calculating with your eyes and spatially, and you're moving your arm, and let's say someone else is moving the bottle around as well. You're constantly recalculating, and that's effectively AI in self-driving cars. It's observing, making a decision, feeding back, performing an action, change the direction of the steering, change the speed, hit the brake, hit the accelerator, to what degree, to what extent. We take all of this for granted, and that's really what GPUs are doing in combination in part with a CPU, but the GPU is a different type of calculation. It's more efficient at different things. If we then look at that and say an enterprise or a large corporate on scale is doing that a huge amount of times, hundreds of thousands or millions of times a minute, that's incredible scale. And to bring a bit of context to where that sits, when you just tap your card in a supermarket, I don't think people really have a concept of what sits behind that. So give us an idea of what's really going on behind the scenes there.
Yeah, well, behind the scenes, starts with data. You know, when you tap your card, you're sending data, well, conceptually down a line. No, it's a little bit more complex than that, but that data ends up in a data center. So it gets stored on a piece of storage. And then a computer, through its processing capability, picks that data up, does some things with it, and stores the data back again. So it's that constant cycle of data coming in, processing happening to create another piece of data is what's happening.
And to build on that, if you think you're a supply chain manager, or you're an HR manager, or you're a store manager, describe the type of roles and the technology that sits in between so that the data can flow through and the individuals can make decisions. Because how do you know when you've run out of eggs? How do you know if the store's even open? Are there staff there at the till, or are they automated? Who's securing it? You begin to build up this massive mental picture, and all of that needs managing.
Yes. And the management, well, there's two parts to the management. There's the sort of more technical side of it that's there, and that's where part of the systems, like operating systems, database management systems for security systems, crypto type systems, all cut in. They're managing the data and the computers. The managing of the process is often very dependent on the reference data. You know, for example, do you know if the store is open or not? You first have to define, well, what's the definition of opening times? And so humans still have to configure that. There's nothing really in the world that's going to automatically, you know, tell the computer when the store is open and close. So the feedback loop then becomes taking the actual data against the reference data and doing a comparison, which is very like humans. You know, if you think about how you move to pick something up, you're very rapidly saying, this is where I want my hand to be, and you're monitoring its progress. So you're reconciling the actual against the plan almost unconsciously. So computers work in a very similar way around knowing what's the desired outcome and measuring the actual against it and doing the reconciliation to see where the gap is.
It actually reminds me of Disneyland in a weird way. One of you find a picture of underneath Disneyland.
Okay.
So again, the illusionary experience as a consumer or as a normal person in a company with a job, you imagine, or even any experience such as Disneyland or anything, underneath that, and this is a really interesting example of it, there's almost a whole mechanical universe operating, and Disneyland sits on top of it. So people are having fun with Mickey Mouse, they're on the rides, they're eating candy floss. Life seems pretty good. You're being entertained. And underneath, I think the first time I saw it was something like Beverly Hills Cop. And there's a scene in one of them where he's underneath, and it's a whole mechanized world. Let's see what they can find. Put that one up. So that doesn't look so Disney, but that's underneath Disney.
It's hard to get photos. It's almost like
Yeah, I'd imagine they'd probably keep that away from the public domain as much as possible. So there's a documentary where it shows what happens when your social media profiles are effectively, I wouldn't say weaponized, but the granularity and depth, and some CEOs of some of these big social media companies, the social dilemma, that's it. And it gives a hint to what's happening to analyze and assess, to almost predict what you're going to do, what you're going to want to buy, when you're going to be hungry. And that's the advertising data which has been sold. So the front end and the back end of what's really going on are universes apart. And when you really look under the hood, I mean, that goes back to the idea of AI the first time around. And I mean, it sounds crazy really thinking about it. But the Terminator movie, Expert Systems,
Right.
that's what Professor Sharples was referring to. And the fear and the backlash against AI, that AI would take over the nuclear codes and create a nuclear war. It's around the Ronald Reagan time, Star Wars. And they just changed the branding of it, in effect. And all of that technology was very deeply propagated. Now we're on the commercial side of it, which is off the back of really social in many ways. But looking at how things are marketed, how things are sold, just that inquisitive nature of looking underneath the surface and realizing things for what they are. There is huge opportunity, and obviously there's risk. But when you really look into how things have evolved and what could happen, we always talk about trust and truth and how important that is. I think it would be good to explore where you are today in your involvement in AI and why in the context of all of that.
Yeah. So it is about bringing it to the market ultimately, and in a more commercial way to organizations. So it could be private sector or public sector. So therefore it's quite different to, I'll say, what people might perceive as AI right now through things like ChatGPT. And it's bringing out a new mathematical method. You know, the mathematical method's been around for at least 35 years. And the question I was asking myself is, you know, why now? Why, after all that time, given that the theory has been there, what's making it happen now? And one of the reasons is coming back to the scalability and cost. Same with ChatGPT and these type of things, where you can get access to processing and data storage and networks at a far lower cost than you ever could. So it takes it from being something that's a piece of theory or a dream to something that you can do. What we're looking to do on the Azaris side is the containment around security, so that it becomes a boundary around each organization's data, so that it's not being fed back into the public language learning models, and it's kept secure. In computing terms, it's nothing new, because it's taking data, computing it, and creating results. So that general process of, you know, input, process, output is just the same. The engine in the middle is a new piece that becomes feasible because of the evolution of the infrastructure technology. Is what Azaris are currently out to do. And there's also the human layer around it, because I think one of the other things that is significant, and you know, companies I think like Apple and have done well with this, is around how does the human interact with the technology, because what Azaris are looking to do is really more around what's called human artificial intelligence. So it's enabling the person as opposed to just giving them an instruction. So it's almost like having your own personal advisor, where a system will give you the recommended action and along with the reasons. So I ran an interesting experiment this week with ChatGPT, where I asked it some questions and it gave some answers. When I asked it to give the reasoning for the answers, it was silence, which is quite interesting. And this comes back to your point about trust. I think anyone who's looking to make, let's say, a decision, it could be as simple as just buying something in a store, then if you're told what this particular product does, you'll often ask to say, show me or tell me why. And that becomes part of a trust thing. Whereas if you've got AI and it's purely giving you, here's my recommendation without the reasoning, then would you trust it? Don't know. Quite interesting that sometimes people will trust the computer without the backup evidence. So that's one of the differences that with the Azaris implementation we're looking to do. It puts out what are called human readable rules. So as an expert, it could be someone who's a clinician or someone working in the finance industry to make investment decisions, then as well as the answer, it will give you the reasoning as well. So therefore, as a human, you can make a judgment on what to do. And the step beyond that, you can tune the rules. And I've had a personal experiment running over the last couple of years with financial exchange artificial intelligence robots, where it is basically, in this case, algorithmic AI doing financial exchange transactions. And out of 5 robots, 2 crashed and they managed to trade themselves to zero, and 3 of them were successful. Now, the net effect of all of them was it just went back to the start. When I started to probe on the answers as to why does this happen, why was the artificial intelligence getting to these conclusions, then there were no answers.
It's going to be frustrating.
It is a little bit.
This works and that doesn't work.
Can you tell me why? And
yeah, I mean, music is similar, where people can stumble across, that works, and something can be a hit. Well, that doesn't work, and why? And often people won't know why, which is why there's so few great songwriters and producers. There are very few people that can understand what works. And it's not necessarily what you like, but it's what works. And ultimately it is what the majority like. And trading is a similar sort of thing. You've got to not make massive errors, and you've got to be able to do something on the basis that it will be positive more often than not. I mean, some traders I know have said to me, all you've got to do is be right 51% of the time to make money. Yeah. But if you can't see why, then you end up in the black box situation. And that's one of the real compelling issues. So when we talk about trust and truth, it is that black box element. And black box just means, in layman's terms, you don't know what's happening. You don't know why.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the original context of saying, if that's being put into how we run our lives and how we run our businesses and how things operate globally, then you're kind of just gambling.
Yes, and this is the conclusion I got to with this experiment, that there was a degree of gambling. The latest part of this experiment is I fired it back up again with one robot, and it was based on human complemented trading. And I've only run this for 1 month. I'm very curious to see what the results have been. And in 1 month, it's had a 50% gain. Now, that's too short a time to get to an ultimate conclusion. But I spent some time with the experts, the people who do the financial exchange trading and have done for many years and really understand it. And that hybrid of the person and the artificial intelligence seems to be getting far superior results. And I'll have to run the experiment for longer to get to the ultimate conclusion. But also what it does is it mitigates that risk of, I'll call it the catastrophic crash, because the human can intervene when we can see those things happening. And I was kind of thinking along the lines of, if you look at some of the avionics thing, a pilot surrounded by some very clever instrumentation and artificial intelligence, but ultimately can take control when it's an appropriate thing to do.
Well, that's a peculiar. A lad I grew up with, he created the world's first self-healing laser-guided missile system. So, and it's simple math.
Yeah.
It sounds super complex and fancy, but effectively, you have numerous sensors which are making a calculation, or there's a calculation made based upon radar type system, telemetry, speed, gyrometers, multiple different things. I don't know the exact specifics. I used to remember, but not so much anymore. So the net calculation of all of these particular things is understanding where it is in its trajectory and how accurate it is to the target. Now, if any one of those components fails, then it could think it's making a calculation, but that could be veering off 500, 1,000 yards. And instead of hitting a target, it could hit a school.
Yeah.
So it was always constantly polling every particular thing and saying, can you validate that you are still operational? And if one of those systems was in fact not working, then it could recalculate and almost self-heal in order to take everything in context in consideration, rather than assuming that a data set was correct, but it had kind of lagged and didn't change, because that would just create everything to steer further and further and further off, with potentially catastrophic consequences, because you don't use missiles to play tennis. You know, they have a very particular function, and it's not something you can really afford to get wrong. I mean, that must be 25 years ago or something,
Yeah.
a long, long time ago. But the same applies. It seems with AI, it's very slapdash, and people are happy to do things because it seems cool. Also, you know, we've discussed before, and many people are becoming more and more aware. If you're trying to grab market share in a sector, and you're trying to drive business and adoption for your company as a major player, there'll be shortcuts. And we've seen a lot of shortcuts with the majors. And again, it goes back to if you took the word AI out on a major tech rollout and implementation for systems which are behind the scenes, like the underground of Disney, knowing that things could go wrong, which could lead to potentially catastrophic outcomes, would you allow that to happen? It seems we kind of have. Well, we haven't, but the narrative and everything being pushed out, the implementation into business tools and tools across our personal lives as well, has happened, and it's time to begin to realise what could that mean, both in a positive and negative manner. And it always comes back to, for a human being to assess, because we can look at it from, well, that sounds plausible. What is it? The Dunning-Kruger
Yep.
effect, which appears, no, I say it like I believe it, therefore it must be true. And in effect, ChatGPT is wonderful at seeming plausible, but is it?
I think it's plausible as a perception, but it also comes down to, I'll call it a human knowledge expert. You know, if I was to get feedback, say, on some surgical methods, you know, I am not a knowledge expert in that whatsoever, not part of my background. So I would have no way of establishing whether that information was valid, sufficiently accurate or not. But someone who that is their profession and has expertise in it can. And so it's having the person, the human at the end, who has what I would think of as background knowledge to draw upon. When you apply that with the information coming from our system, whether it's got AI in it or not, it doesn't matter, then that's where you could probably get the best outcomes in many cases. But it does rely on that knowledge expertise that can be very specific to what it's being applied to.
Which comes to the point of how we understand on one side and how generalized AI is communicated. For example, in regulated industries, and we're not talking necessarily just the obvious financial services, but how about a plumber, electrician? So would you just get somebody to come and do your plumbing if they weren't actually a plumber, but it can seem plausible? Well, I've got a generalized AI. There's the devil's in the detail on the specificity and the qualification. And we keep seeing it comes back to experience. And I always thought when I was young, I don't need experience, like every young idiot. Over time, you make mistakes, you do things, some things work, some things don't. And with age, you get experience. And then you begin to realize that's the nuance, that's the thing which almost can't be taught, because you're applying a number of experiences and knowledge and information and observing, so the sensory element, observing what's around, and you're able to understand context. And context changes everything. You add all that together and you can look at it and say, well, now that really is interesting, and I'll make a decision based on that, which to an outsider or a non-experienced person, non-qualified person, can look silly. And it's only 3-4 steps ahead that you realise, or from the outside perspective, it's realised why that decision further back made sense.
Yeah, it does. And I'm often talking and even coaching people on what I classify as critical thinking. And there's a phrase which I often use, which is, there's no such thing as an accident, just lack of anticipation. And because I think what humans in a truly experienced position do is they're thinking about what's the consequences of failure. And upon that, they're making decisions on whether to proceed with an action or not. So coming back to your point with a plumber or an electrician, it depends on the specific task. There's some of the tasks they do that if it went wrong, no bad things happen. At the other end of the scale, there's some really bad things that can happen. And it's having that's where the experience becomes applicable, because as a human, one of the things humans are sort of maybe unique for is anticipating and envisaging the future. So you're also like coming up with an idea, taking actions to move towards that outcome. And in doing that, you're thinking about, if I can see something that's going to go wrong, I will stop, or I'll reverse, or I'll take a different action. Whereas some of the AI side of things, unless it's actually programmed in that way, it will just proceed.
You see, this is where it becomes very interesting, because you could look at an existing organization functioning in whichever sector or industry it's in, and utilize AI to leverage the experience and expertise and knowledge of people that really do understand, because they've been around a long time and are validated to perform really, really well. So enhance their knowledge across the organization, because not everyone, probably the majority of any company, is not going to be the long-term. I mean, some companies are new, so you can't have that. So you could utilize artificial intelligence, but the minds of really great people to almost oversee and protect and enhance and look for steps which should or could have been taken to avoid potentially negative outcomes, and inform and educate and actually enhance the ability of people on the basis. I mean, it's like anything. When you get the old wise man, Mr. Miyagi, teaching the younger one something, Mr. Miyagi won't have the agility or the youth and all the benefits. So it's constantly changing description. What was strong on one hand could be considered a weakness on another, but also that same thing from a different perspective could be a weakness and a strength. And it's really enabling the best of the upsides and reducing the downsides across the board. Because again, from a sales perspective or a risk perspective, a risk manager could say, that's a really bad situation, we don't want to do that. But that would mean removing massive sales opportunity. So for the sales guys, like, well, why are you preventing sales? And I used to hear all the time, somebody who worked for Oracle, they would have a sales prevention department, they jokingly called it, and they would find every reason a deal shouldn't go through, which would really annoy the sales guys. But it was probably very sensible on the other hand. Nothing is ever black and white, it's all grey area.
No, I agree. You take that particular example. I think that's maybe just the way corporations set themselves up, is to find a balance. I'm not saying that's the optimal way of doing it or the best way of doing it. Is somebody's incentive to just go get sales and make things happen, and another person's incentive to stop the wrong thing happening, and therefore they have a negotiation and some collaboration to do. So I think that's a structural thing within corporations.
But also the flow of information as well. I mean, we saw a huge amount of times when someone in an organisation was aware of information which could have been really useful and helpful to reduce risk or create opportunity, but they sat in a different place to someone else who actually had to enact what was going on or could have capitalised upon the opportunity. So that information didn't flow. So the amount of loss in opportunity or actual physical loss was significantly more than it should have been. Now, AI could leverage that knowledge and experience and be observing constantly to then inform and enable people to do much, much better jobs, as opposed to being a risk. But even with our friend who's an actress and producer, on one hand, she doesn't want her identity stolen and effectively to be put into various sequels, not paid, and there's an AI version of her. But as a producer, it enables the ability to tell stories at a fraction of the cost at an extremely high quality. So it's extremely democratic and democratizing and creates opportunity and a chance for people who otherwise wouldn't get it. On the other side, it could. So life just isn't that black and white, and it's about doing things which are fair. But again, it always comes back to the human input, and to say, right, humans should be able to control AI rather than the other way around. But equally, we could look at it, these big companies run by humans, and they're getting AI to control everything.
Yeah, and this is where some of the paradoxes really start to cut in, and to say who's the arbitrator? Who's going to make the ultimate decision? Is it the human or is it the computer? And I think it becomes very case dependent at that point, because sometimes the computer will arrive at the best answer, whether it's AI or however it is, and sometimes the human will. I was thinking of what's a very simple example of artificial intelligence, and you've got automated speed control in cars, the distance in front, right? Now, I spent a period of my life driving around the M25, which is the circle around London, and pretty much every day somebody had run into the back of somebody else. These were not accidents. These were people who were just being overly optimistic about how quickly they could stop, and and then ran into the back of cars. Whereas the auto distance method, if you just apply that, it wouldn't happen. So it's examples where maybe the human thinks, well, I know best, but they don't always.
But that comes down to trust and trust
Yes.
of systems.
Yeah.
I mean, my car's got it as well, so
Yeah.
it'll just ensure that it's never a problem. But people always believe, well, do I trust it? And you're kind of going off piste quite quickly mentally, where technology could probably and does probably work a huge amount better based on reaction rate, LiDAR systems. But there is that sense of, do I trust it though? And if you've seen it not work once, or you've seen a crash, or if there's any doubt, people will default to themselves. But it is preventable. But at the same time, if you look at the real consequence and damage currently being done, I mean, I even saw yesterday, so ChatGPT 4.5, I believe, came out.
That's right. Yep.
And I read it, and it says one of the aims is to make it hallucinate less. Now, in reality, you could reword that and say, it still lies, just not as much. And you think, well, part of the sales pitch, it lies less than it used to. How in some circumstances could people be happy to put that in, or are they even aware? And of course, that is the particular model tied into, what is the Microsoft version called again?
Copilot.
Copilot.
Yeah, it does get quite fascinating. Yeah, and the trust thing is, I think, going to be talked about more than ever. You take another example. You happily jump in the back of a taxi with a human who's been up for 3 days and likes drinking a lot, but you won't get in the back of the taxi that's an automated driving system. And so the perception of trust versus the reality of trust.
So it really moves into the marketing side, marketing and psychology.
Yeah.
And again, the ironic thing is looking at what Professor Sharples and various others have said, this is not the first time. And he said to us a couple of days ago, history is repeating itself. And the trajectory that we're on now is a near identical trajectory as to the last one, which is around the expert systems and the fears specifically around AI taking over and doing at that time. And again, generationally, it's very different. But people of certain generations will remember living under the threat of nuclear war.
Yeah.
It was very prevalent in every part of culture. There was the Cold War. There was all of these different components. And I think we said before, the most dangerous time for a trading floor at a bank is the day the last person who was part of or present during a financial crash retires, because there's no more lived experience. So we are in a different generation where there is no real lived experience of living under the threat of a nuclear holocaust. But that was very much the Hunt for Red October. I mean, even our old Scottish James Bond was, at the heart of films and popular culture about that.
Yeah.
Now it's very different. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger became super famous off the back of it, legendary. But again, it's just different times. People have forgotten.
Yeah, it is. But it's almost like an evolution extrapolation of those times. What the technology can do, whether it's classified as AI or not, is substantially more than it used to be able to do. But the human still has to make those decisions, not necessarily about what the computer is recommending, but should that be used or not. So the human is still there. And you think about all the actions of all of this data and computation, that its endpoint ultimately is a human in most cases. That it's affecting them in some way, either about what action they take or what they experience. But as long as the human, I would say, feels in control, whether they are in reality or not is a different question. But if they feel in control, then some of the trust is there. They just need to be assured that the control that they perceive they have is appropriate.
I look at this very much like transportation. So as a human, you can choose a mode of transportation, and you could have a school bus, a motorbike, a Ferrari, a Ford. You could have a minivan. You could have a tractor. There are many things that could be considered modes of transport, but they will have widely different functions. And the underlying capabilities, such as engines, wheels, braking systems, they all contribute. And when we talk about AI currently, it's like everyone assumes we're only talking about a car. When in reality, there are many, many, many capabilities and many, many reasons and functions that AI has. We've discussed our particular variation is enterprise-wide, making data available, observing on a trusted and truthful manner to make sense of it all in order to be the equivalent of many, many people, but refining it based upon human methodology in a way, but enabling lots of different types and flavors of data to describe the world that we live in.
Yes.
So externally, internally, everything. And then that delivers context. So we're all about context on a massive scale, but equally on an individual scale, case by case. My interpretation of Izaris is understanding efficacy and high specificity in and around use cases where we're working on a project using information to understand how to better create efficiency. And the way I would interpret it would be you want as near guaranteed accuracy as possible. So people could achieve it of a certain level, but then you can create explainability and enhance its ability to perform even better. Yes. So if you put that in a healthcare setting, these are the circumstances where, well, if it doesn't quite go right, bad health outcomes have the very, very worst end, means you're dead. In financial terms, you can either make money or you might go broke. So really compelling, really important circumstances where applying technology more than moves the needle, it can be absolutely critical. I mean, would you say that's an accurate representation?
I do. And I see sort of two parts to that. One is, one of my other hobbies back in the day was technical drawing. I used to love it, still do. But in the mechanical design world, is you're taught all about tolerances. Yeah, and what to make things function, what's allowable tolerances and tolerance build-up and those kind of things. But coming back to also the consequences of failure, so the accuracy, how tight that is and how accurate it is, I think is very dependent on what the requirement is. If something like traveling for a meeting. Now, if Google Maps tells you that's plus or minus 10 minutes, it might be okay. You'd show up early, you say, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late. But you're right, it becomes surgical decisions. Then the tolerances have to be much tighter. But that relates back to the consequences of failure. And I think where, AI and related technologies can become significant. One of my favorite TED Talks is by Tali Sharrow about the human optimism bias. So humans are evolved to be optimistic on average. So anything you desire, you will underestimate typically how long it will take and how much it's going to cost and these kind of things. In the UK, anyone that's watched a TV program called Homes Under the Hammer for refurbishing homes, how many people come in on time and budget? Very few. So that's the human optimism in play. So therefore, if you bring in artificial intelligence, then how it's programmed or how it's using patterns around other methods, it doesn't have that. So it might be that the answer that it's providing is in fact the more accurate one, because what it's counterbalancing is that it evolved human optimism bias that was evolved when, if you had to go eat, you would happily go and take a risk against a lion to go and kill what you wanted. That's how humans have evolved ultimately, or have succeeded with whatever 8 billion people on the planet, is through the optimism bias. So that's where I think some of the benefits of artificial intelligence can cut in. I've certainly seen it in some of my sales operations world, and that's where it came across that TED Talk, was part of a sales organization that would never meet its forecast, right? And it was a particular part of the world where That optimism bias seems to be just part of the culture. And I was asking myself the question that, why have we got other parts of the organisation who are coming within a certain an allowable tolerance around forecasting, and one part in a particular part of the world we're not. And I was thinking, is it to do with data or process? And it was in the Middle East. Yeah, particularly around the United Arab Emirates. Yeah, and it was a cultural thing. And it was the optimism bias. That's all it was. No, the correction was you just brought the numbers down by a percentage because there was a pattern.
Right.
So there was even consistency of the level of optimism bias that was happening.
You see, this is also interesting because there's a generic, generalized assumption, and we find it with any and almost every form of data. When you generalize, you flatten the curve, and you lose the insights. You lose the valuable bits of information. So if you look at everything individually and specifically, and this is where we use geotemporal to describe different times and different places, but on a completely unique basis, you do tend to find everywhere and everything is not the same. And there could be edge cases which are extremely different, and there's usually reason for that. But if you squash it all down and just do it average hides all of the interesting things. It hides the opportunities, but it can mask the risks as well. And obviously you're from Scotland. My family were from Scotland. And if you look at Londoners, but even Londoners, when we're talking about sort of Cockneys or Chelsea, and then you look at the West Country, you look at South Wales, North Wales, Manchester, Leeds, we're all a little bit different in behavioural ways.
Yes.
And we're not saying good or bad, but we're a little bit different. Even our accents. I mean, the UK is probably the one place that you could hear someone speak and geolocate them within probably 10 miles.
Yeah.
Which is remarkable.
Yes.
And that's because of the nuanced differences. And then you could probably understand that you could almost read into the probability of whether they like sport, what type of sport. Is it going to be rugby? Is it going to be football? And if it's football, what team? And then you probably read what sort of music they're, maybe not so much now, but you used to be able to say what music they'd be into.
Yep.
So one person opens their mouth once, and you've built this massive context of information, which can then subsequently, through conversation, be validated. And that's effectively how social media profile is working on incredible multi-billion scale in real time. But it's not really anything different to what we do instinctively in conversation.
Yeah, I agree. It's that. Although I've got to say that my experience around some of the social media profiling, I'm active on these things as just an individual, partially just for information gathering on things I need to know about. But the accuracy of that profiling in terms of what I receive is just wildly out. I receive things that I just have no interest in. So there's something not right around that behind the scenes. I don't know what, but it's not right.
This probably comes down to, are you an active participant or an observer? Because if the more that you post, then the more accurate. But then if you take that mindset, you begin to realize why our information is so extremely valuable.
Yeah, that's a real good point. I hadn't considered that, and I would say I'm probably about 95% consumer, 5% active. So it's very dominated by consumption of information for business purposes and just personal hobby purposes.
But as you slide down the generations, the amount that they give out is astronomically more. They're massive data creators, which is effectively, they're revealing more and more, so they're easier to sell to.
Yeah.
Although there is also a gap where generations younger are very much rejecting giving themselves away. They're much more conscious about their privacy and what information they're prepared and provided to give, which I'm sure is very frustrating. But if you can provide efficiency and say, well, look, we're going to take everything from you, but in a way where we're going to understand how to make your life easier and play on certain elements of convenience and efficiency. So we'll give you what is perceived to be more value, and you give us X. I think that historically is washed in the retail world, the consumer world, but I've never really seen that work in the business world.
I agree. I haven't either. I've not seen that. No, an interesting thought, but I as to why not sure, but
Well,
it's interesting.
I think it becomes more clear of why not, because you're only as good as your competitive advantage. If you're willing, let's say the Coca-Cola company, let's say they open sourced the recipe for Coca-Cola. Well, there wouldn't be much of a Coca-Cola for that long.
No.
It's very unique. Imagine the top hedge funds, investment banks, published their investment strategies, and their quants published everything on blogs of what they're doing. Well, they wouldn't be top investment banks or hedge funds for long. That's a very obvious kind of visual idea. But name any business in any walk of life, even artists that gave away all their secrets, they don't. I mean, you can create something and have a movement which is open source in a way, and that has happened. But still, the human element, the magic of it, is something unique. That's why football clubs want to keep their best players, because if you're happy to give away your best assets, then there's not going to be a Premier League champion, or the balance of everything goes.
Yeah.
It's not about being selfish, but it's we don't leave our doors open and invite people in to steal all of our things in our house. We have locks on our doors. The whole world is designed to say, yeah, we'll work hard for things, we'll create things, we'll be kind and we'll share, but we don't want to be have everything stolen from us.
Yeah.
And
I agree, and I think that some of the legal protection around that, I think, is highly significant. Whether it's copyrights or patents, those kind of things, because that's what gives
it's protection.
People the investment. If you imagine, you think, well, I'd like to invest in this particular thing as a development, then if you didn't have the protection later on, you probably wouldn't do it. Now, the outcome of that on a mass scale is evolution would be significantly slower. Yeah, so people wouldn't have the confidence, and that's what could happen if people feel that they're not confident. So the case I'm working on right now with Azaris, then that is an investment. There's investors, including myself, and we want to have enough confidence that there will be a return on that investment. That's not the sole reason doing it. I'm doing it just for the financial reasons, because there's a lot of benefits to others that come out of this particular initiative.
But it's the same on a human level.
Yeah.
I mean, to parent a child, to want to give that kid the best life possible, to want to give it the best education possible, it's not necessarily all cold hard business. It's a human trait to want to do the best that we can to protect the things around us. It's a human instinct.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, whether it's from any particular risk, you want that layer of protection so you can have a safe environment.
Yes.
And that naturally means not allowing the things that you value most to be stolen from you.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's far more human.
It is, and especially around society. I happened to be listening to an article on LBC, which is a London radio, in the car last week. It was about the prison service. It was a guy who'd been in prison, and he was saying it was like selfishness on steroids. The people in there are extremely selfish, not just being in there, but before they were in there. but then have no respect for the, if you like, the law that surrounds it. So as humans, I think having a degree of selfishness is ultimately probably a healthy thing, because if you're not looking after yourself, you can't help others. So it's a bit like the classic, in an airplane, put your mask on first before you help others. Whilst people work within an agreed set of rules or parameters, then it all works. But once those start to break down,
I suppose that is the concept of, in many ways, democracy.
Yes.
And everyone choosing to agree that we live within some form of structure.
Yeah.
I mean, it does open questions as old as time, such as, well, what happens if the people we put in position to protect us and to serve us get a bit naughty? Yeah. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. But I think for people's ability to relate what's going on here, there's got to be a trust as a foundation for us to do anything. I mean, even on a football team, when you have smooth passing all around and you create opportunity and you can cut the opposition apart and score beautiful goals, or know that when the other team are attacking that you can defend, you do so as a unit. You do so instinctively knowing and trusting, I don't need to look that I know that player's making a run, so I'm going to put the ball for. It's an element of trust, isn't it? And things work better when we understand and can agree there is a basis to move forward. Sometimes that's enforced, sometimes that's cultured and developed. And if we look at what we understand and know in ways that we can relate and say, now let's look at what's happening with how AI is coming to the fore, how different it all is, because, I mean, every football team can be different. I had a box at Gillingham once, very different football to a Premier League game. Still really enjoyable, but the levels of skill certainly weren't there. But it was enjoyable in a different way. All AI is not the same, and how can we look at what's happening currently in the context of what we do understand? And very quickly and instinctively, people will come to the conclusion of where is value, where people are acting a little bit naughty, and what crosses the line of what we find acceptable, and in the context of our personal lives, our kids' lives, our business lives, our own businesses, our jobs, and where does the relationship of human and AI intersect?
Yeah, and I think perhaps the bit that's changing is the quantity that AI can do within that human decision making or life experience. It's expanding. You can delegate more to the computer than you previously could.
And I think that you can scale the quantity if you can guarantee the quality.
Yes.
And I think it goes back to the flaw of some AI, saying more is better.
Not necessarily.
More is not always better.
No.
And just pumping more and more information to become more generalized.
No, I think it's about coming back to very specific needs. I mean, I guess my probably most used piece of AI is Google Maps for directions and estimating how long a journey is going to take in a car.
Well, the difference, as you said, plus or minus 10 minutes. If it's plus or minus 3 hours and you get it wrong and it's a job interview, maybe you're not getting the job. There are certain things which, it goes back to what you said before. What's your tolerance?
It's your tolerance and consequence of failure. Even take like getting to where I am today, right? Then, personally, I like to be on time. That's just what I like doing. Look at the train times, and I just put half an hour contingency in it. Yeah. Now, so you still got that human decision making going on.
Yeah, because you can still override, can't it?
You can override it.
That's always the thing.
Yeah.
If you're early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. If you're late, you're fired.
Yeah.
Not my rule, but
It's that type of thing. But coming back to the trust bit, then you know, do I trust the auto navigation piece? And the answer is yes. It's better than me as a human, because you know what I can't see is the breakdowns, the traffic jams that the satellite can. So
and it's fascinating how that works as well, because a lot of people all communicating, all in the context of where they are specifically, seen from one particular perspective with an intent, a predefined journey at a particular time. Everyone's contributing towards tiny little bits of information which contextually add up to, well, given your goal to get from A to B, all of these people are somewhere along, maybe even traveling in a different direction, but they can all contribute towards the impact of your goal. I mean, that's really what a navigation is these days, which is a remarkable thing, which is a combined group effort on observation of lots of data points in the context of a goal. Of course, I mean, that's a long explanation for, well, are we going to be late, Dad?
Yeah, it is. But that's sort of an example of what I consider is human artificial intelligence, a hybrid, that you utilising the technology for a specific case, and for benefit. There's probably no real downside to it. But as a human, you're making the ultimate decision on what action to take, because you can compute things like the consequences of failure and all of these other things. And so there's plenty of cases like that, I think, out there in terms of how you as a human you utilize the technology. I think where some of the risk might lie is just that blind belief of what the artificial intelligence is telling you. That's probably where the risk lies, that you just blindly believe it. Even though there's no reasoning.
That is where there's a danger. And it's the same as well. It's like a politician saying, it'll be fine, we won't tax you on this, we won't tax you on that. Great, he's never going to do that. Well, how often does that turn out to be true?
It is, and it comes back to the underlying reasoning. Again, a case just from last week. One of the things that's happening in the UK is some reorganisation of what we think of as county councils, basically part of the country in public administration. And this county council had put out a particular statement about fantastic benefits that were going to happen. And I went back and said, can you tell me what they are and why? And it was silence. So it comes back to the reasoning. So even as humans on the other end of it, you, as the receiver of it, I think rational individuals would look to have some supporting evidence.
Yeah, and usually it's just a case of PR. And are you listening to information which is validated, or are you being sold something, sold an idea? So
it is, and maybe it's different personality types. I know personally, in my head when I hear something, I've got that. Why is that?
But there's I think a big reason and a big change, and this goes back to education. Other people we've had on, which is, if you can ask a question and immediately through convenience come to a conclusion, but you don't know why, how can you discern whether what you've been told is right or wrong, because you have zero context? So people are becoming more and more used to, oh, well, that's right. It's almost creating the Dunning-Kruger effect en masse. But of course, it's easier to control people like that. And it's easier to get away with stuff. And if people are getting used to just hearing conclusions and not really thinking it through, that means you can say anything and people will buy it.
It does, and it comes back to different sort of human behavioural types. Another one of my favourite TED Talks is by Julia Galef. I can't recall the exact title, but basically, are you a soldier or a scout? And she basically talks about 20% of the population are scouts and 80% are soldiers. So the scout profile is probably a bit like us. You hear something and you want to know why, you want to understand it. Whereas the soldiers are, once they hear something, I'm off. That's what I'm going to do. And so you think about that in the context of artificial intelligence, then the scouts are probably guarded against the downside of artificial intelligence because they'll be asking the questions why, but the soldiers won't. They'll just start believing it, which comes back to some of the affirmation bias and what you just said around the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Well, it has a huge amount of ingredients for a very interesting next couple of years. So on that point, and the last main question or thought, what do you think the future is with regards to AI and how the world will unfold?
It's going to become far more prevalent. It's going to be embedded in many things. So more and more decisions will be made around data-fed artificial intelligence. So on balance, I think the outcomes will be better than they currently are, because good implementations of artificial intelligence will, on balance, make better decisions than the humans. So I think that's one of the key things. You won't necessarily see all of that, because coming back to what we discussed earlier around, say, data centers, then that's all behind the scenes. It's the tip of the iceberg bit. What's inside the iceberg, you can't see, but a lot of that will be embedded. And there will be other parts of it that you can see. We were discussing an Apple Watch earlier today. Yeah, you can see that. And that already effectively has artificial intelligence built into it. And that will increase. But so it will become more prevalent, but I don't think it's not going to replace humans in that respect, because I think most of the end point decisions will still be humans making those kind of decisions. And I think, part of which may come back to some of the, where does liability lie? Imagine you went to court one day and some bad thing had happened, you can go, it wasn't me, it was the computer. Would that really stand up in court? It's, I suspect not right now. But it'll be interesting to see how the law evolves around artificial intelligence. I think that's going to be another interesting bit that some of the legal systems are already starting to get challenged with, around things like copyright law and patent law and some of those things. That it's not quite sure what to do yet.
Excellent. Cool. Graham, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.